I think the common ground in an organization lies within the values of the organization, and that's the aligning point.
Mm-hmm.
And then that, I think, once we realize that, it becomes quite easy to align to that, because either as an individual, that's something you want to align to or not. And if it's not, then you won't stay. And as an organization, as individuals that don't fit in that spot, then they will need to exit the situation if you can't align them. But I think we get confused when we forget that's the point of having the company culture and the company values in the first place, so that we don't argue over what's right and what's wrong, because if it's not fitting the values, then it's wrong.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation.
So the other columnists looked at ethical leadership and innovation. So I think it would be really interesting if we had a similar conversation. And I'm going to kick off with you, Jo. So what I find really interesting from my understanding from autistic people is that there's a really strong sense of justice. So have you ever seen that there's an issue or a concern where an autistic person will see something and deem it not ethical, but the neurotypical deems it as? And is there kind of a situation? How would you deal with that? How would you suggest an autistic person deal with that difference in opinion on what's ethical and what isn't?
Yeah, as you say, very strong sense of justice, right and wrong. It can come down to how it is expressed and whether or not there's a chance to think about it, discuss it, to get an understanding of an understood ground. Criticism of performance might be ethical if the autistic person hasn't understood what is required and based on past experience, quite often gets upset. For me, ethics is leadership that grows the person, working together with. So it's more like on a level ground, being able to go to and fro. Can we go away and think, actually, can I have somebody with me so that I can understand the neurotypical understanding of that situation?
So if so from your perspective, then it's not ethical if people aren't growing from that interaction.
Yes.
Okay. Brilliant. Do you have a question for Ben?
Ethics is obviously quite a complicated understanding. If I'm different from as a neurodivergent from neurotypicals. So how would you understand as ethics and communication fit in with your understanding of life and storytelling?
Interesting question. I like that. The first comes down to definitions of words. We all define words differently. My view of neurodiverse and what neurodiverse means might be different from yours, might be different from Judith's. My definition of ethics may be different from the two of you. Doesn't make mine right, doesn't make yours wrong. It makes it different. We all reach this world based on our past education, the experiences we have, and how we have assimilated that information into our psyche. What I think is right, you may think is absolutely wrong. What you think is right, I might vehemently be opposed to. Ethics, to me, is a word that needs to be defined within a tribe, within a group. What do we as an organization, what do we as a team, what do we think is right and what is wrong? And it has to be some consensus. Because if there isn't consensus, and we all look and says, well, you need to be more ethical. Well, the question is, what does that mean? What does an ethical leader truly mean? And I can give you 1,000 different definitions of what an ethical leader could be. And until we as a group because we're never going to decide this as a world, but as a small group that interacts with each other or interacts with different groups, you need to have a common language before you can define, is this something ethical or not ethical? You need to, as a group, you need to be able to decide what are the parameters of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Ben, do you have a question for me?
I would like to see, what do you think from a leadership point of view? I mean, ethics and leadership is an interesting, concept, but how do you define ethics and leadership, and how does that make you a better leader by being more ethical, in your opinion?
Oh, wow. I think I was nodding away for the first part, thinking, yeah, that's easy to answer. And the second part, oh, that's a little bit harder to answer.
Well, that's what I aim for.
I think if we, like you were saying before, we think about ethics being a collection of beliefs, and what's accepted and what's not accepted from the tribe, the community, then when we think about it in terms of leadership, well, it's almost like saying, if our company culture and values is such as this, then when you act within those things, you are ethical. An individual may have a different understanding of what ethical actually means. You could work if we look around, we'll see many things where society has deemed to be right and ethical. And as a person, you may not agree to do that. So that's how I think in terms of like ethical leadership tends to be, if we were going to be a purist, leading within the confines of what the group says is ethical or not. I think what we sometimes allude to is maybe the morality of an individual. Is my ethics okay and aligned to the group? And I think that makes it a lot harder. Does it make you better leader to be ethical? Well, it depends on whose ethics that you're working on. If you was working in Lehman Brothers, for example, the ethical standpoint there may well be quite different from what the rest of the world was considering as ethical. So in that environment, then yes, you may well be really ethical. And then you stepped outside it and people are saying, no, you're not. I think like with most things, leadership is personal. And I think understanding where your own ethics and values are and whether you can be aligned to the others can make the biggest difference. What do you think, Ben? Does that make sense to you?
It does. I mean, but it's also sitting there going, as a leader, do my personal ethics get in the way of me being a good leader? If you are within a situation where your biases and your sense of right and wrong is diametrically opposed to the ideas within the people that you lead, how do you make that into the aggregate? How do you bring all that together? Because there's those challenges of sitting there going, how do we get people on the same page to be able to sit there and say, you believe X, I believe Y. There's nothing wrong with understanding it, but where do we find the common ground?
Yeah, I think the common ground in an organization lies within the values of the organization, and that's the aligning point. So if you're an organization that values honesty, compassion, and something, being impactful, for example, then everything that you do needs to fit within those value sets, and that would be determined on what would become ethical in that environment. And then that, I think, once we realize that, it becomes quite easy to align to that, because either as an individual, that's something you want to align to or not. And if it's not, then you won't stay. And as an organization, as individuals that don't fit in that spot, then they will need to exit the situation if you can't align them. But I think we get confused when we forget that's the point of having the company culture and the company values in the first place, so that we don't argue over what's right and what's wrong, because if it's not fitting the values, then it's wrong. And I was wondering, Joe, in terms of autistic individuals. Do you think there might be times when there's a lack of, like, neurotypicals don't make it clear because not every company has like written values? Could you think that might cause some issues?
Um, yes, and even where there are written values, you're not always actually regularly reminded of them.
Mm-hmm.
And our understanding of what those values are may actually differ from how the company mean it. And we may think, actually, we may not actually quite fit in with what those are, and which can cause misunderstandings.
Mm.
And sometimes we may have a very clear way of how maybe how we see the world, and you just simply forget what it is. We get into our own little ways.
I think, thank you for that. I think it then, Ben, it comes back to your point really about effective communication, because I know obviously you're all about aligning that in teams.
Absolutely.
So yeah, do you have any ideas on how to resolve that issue that Jane was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I get so many companies where leadership says, well, can you fix our teams? And the answer is no. The answer is we need to fix you before we can fix your teams. Values are wonderful things until they're not lived. And most organizations go away. They create mission, vision, value statements. They have a wonderful weekend. They play a couple rounds of golf. They put wonderful words on pieces of paper. They come back. They put it on 200-point font on the wall, and then they never live it. Or they really never define it. They sit there and say, employees are important to us. Okay, but what does that mean in terms of our day-to-day living within the organization? How do we get employees to believe that we care about them? What are the actions that we actually take on a day-to-day basis? How do we make decisions? How do we have meetings? How do we have one-on-ones? How do we support? How do we train? How do we coach? How do we mentor? In order to be able to prove to our people that we actually believe that our employees are number one. And it's the actions. It's not just words on a page that matter. It's, because you could say that, I really care about Joe, but if I ignore her, I dismiss her, or if I don't give her the ability to shine, am I truly supporting the employee? So we as companies need to stop with words and sit there and say, what are the concrete actions behind those words that help us actually move forward, to sit there and say, there's a situation and this is how we are supposed to deal with this. And be able to do this and realize that culture is going to evolve and that culture is going to change, and our mission, vision, and values are going to evolve and change as new people come into the group and new situations happen. And we need to sit there and say, we evolve as an organization based on the people that are part of that organization.
Brilliant. And there lies where the innovation comes from, and the clear understanding of where the ethics of the organization lies to make that possible for everyone. Great, guys. That was fantastic. Thank you for joining the panel, and thank you so much for writing for the Maverick Paradox magazine.
Judith, thanks for having us, and we love writing for you.
Same here, and thank you for this session.
You're welcome.
The Maverick Paradox magazine. The Maverick Paradox magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.